The air in the kingdom of Israel had turned toxic. It was a spiritual pollution, an invisible, cloying smog that rose from the 1,000 altars, smoking with profane incense. It carried the sweet, sick scent of apostasy, a perfume of rebellion that clung to the very stones of Samaria and seeped into the cracked soil of the farmlands. In the grand palace, a marvel of ivory and stone, King Ahab ruled in name, but not in spirit. He was a man whose spine was forged from ambition, but tempered with weakness, a hollow chamber of a king whose moral emptiness was filled entirely by the iron will of his wife, Jezebel of Sidon. She was the true power, a tempest in human form, with eyes like chips of obsidian and a relentless devotion to her gods. She was not merely a queen, she was a missionary for a faith of ecstasy and blood. And she had brought her chief god, Baal, the rider of the clouds, the divine king of rain and fertility, and planted his banner in the heart of a nation covenanted to another, and Israel, a people whose history was a testament to the power of a single, jealous God, had forgotten its own story. Under the royal couple's patronage, the nation had enthusiastically traded its austere faith for a more convenient and sensual paganism. The people bent their knees now to carved wood and molten metal, their worship a frenzy of chanting and ecstatic dance. Temples to Baal, opulent and gaudy with the trappings of Phoenician wealth, now overshadowed the simple, forgotten altars of the Lord. The nation was lost, adrift in a sea of pagan ritual, and the silence from heaven was a deafening, terrifying void. Into this miasma of faithlessness walked a man who seemed to be carved from the raw, untamed wilderness itself, Elijah the Tishbite. He was not a man of the court or the city. His skin was leathered by a merciless sun and scoured by the desert wind, his hair and beard a tangled, sun-bleached mane, and his eyes held the fierce, unnerving clarity of one who speaks with a consuming fire. He wore a simple garment of camel's hair, cinched at the waist with a leather belt. He carried no sword, no scepter, no sign of worldly authority, yet he walked with a purpose so absolute that the palace guards, men hardened by violence, hesitated in his path. He was a prophet, a living voice for the silent God, an embodiment of the covenant Israel had so casually forsaken. What internal alchemy transforms a man into such a solitary weapon of the divine? Is it a calling that eclipses all personal desire, a form of madness that sees the world with terrifying clarity, or a conviction so profound that the fear of death becomes a triviality? For Elijah, these were not questions but realities, woven into the very fabric of his soul. God's command to him had been terrifyingly simple: go to King Ahab and deliver a warning. There was no promise of safety, no divine shield mentioned, just a command. And so Elijah walked. He strode through the gilded gates of the palace, his rough-spun clothes a stark rebuke to the fine linens and gleaming gold that surrounded him. The courtiers whispered and stared, their faces a mixture of contempt and morbid curiosity. Who was this wild man, and what storm was he bringing with him? Ahab sat on his throne, a study in bored arrogance, with Jezebel beside him, her gaze sharp, cold, and analytical. The guards brought Elijah before them. Ahab looked down his nose at the prophet, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "State your name and your purpose," the king demanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "You disturb the peace of my court." Elijah did not bow, he did not flinch. He met the king's gaze, and his voice, honed by shouting across desert valleys, echoed in the throne room, raw and powerful. "I am Elijah, a prophet of the Lord, the God of Israel, before whom I stand. I have come to tell you what God says." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the sudden, tense silence. "As surely as the Lord lives, the God of Israel, whom I serve, there will be no dew or rain in the land for the next few years until I say so." A stunned silence fell over the court. It was broken by a sharp, brittle peal of laughter from Jezebel. Ahab simply stared, his mind struggling to process the sheer audacity. No rain, no dew, the man was a madman, a religious fanatic. "You threaten my kingdom with a drought?" Ahab sneered, finding his voice. "My God, Baal, controls the rain. He will laugh at your empty words and wash them away with the next storm." Elijah's eyes, however, held no madness, only a chilling certainty. "This will happen because you and your people have turned away from the Lord to worship Baal. You must learn that Baal is a lifeless statue, a lie you tell yourselves. The Lord, the one true God, is in control of everything, including your precious rain." Without another word, before Ahab could summon the rage to order his arrest, Elijah turned and walked out of the palace as boldly as he had entered. The guards, momentarily mesmerized by an authority they could neither define nor defy, did not stop him. He vanished back into the landscape from which he came, leaving behind a prophecy that hung in the air like a death sentence. Days turned into weeks, and Ahab's mockery soured into unease, then into a quiet, gnawing panic. The sky remained a relentless, searing blue. The morning grass was dry, with no trace of the life-giving dew. The vibrant green of the fertile fields faded to a sickly yellow, then a brittle, skeletal brown. The streams and rivers, the lifeblood of the nation, began to shrink, their banks pulling back to expose vast plains of cracked, thirsty mud. A silent, creeping terror began to grip the land. The worshippers of Baal offered frantic sacrifices, their priests chanting on the high places until their throats were raw, but the heavens remained sealed, a brass dome over a dying world. King Ahab and Queen Jezebel were consumed by a cold fury. This was not just a natural disaster, it was a personal humiliation, a political crisis. The wild prophet had challenged their God, and by extension, their authority. They blamed Elijah for the drought, his name a curse on their lips. "Find him," Ahab roared, sending soldiers to scour every town and village. A bounty was placed on his head that would make a poor man a prince. But Elijah was gone, swallowed by the wilderness, hidden by the very God Ahab denied. God's instructions to his prophet had been precise. "Go and hide near the brook of Cherith, east of the Jordan River. You can drink from the brook, and I will command the ravens to bring you food." Trust. It is a simple word, but what does it truly mean in the face of starvation and absolute solitude? It means walking away from everything known, into a desolate ravine, and waiting. Elijah went to the brook. It was a secret, lonely place, a deep gash in the earth where a trickle of water still ran, shielded from the sun. Here the silence was broken only by the whisper of the wind through the rocks and the gurgle of the stream. And here, in this profound isolation, a miracle unfolded, not with fire and thunder, but with the gentle beat of wings. Every morning and every evening, a most unlikely caterer arrived. Ravens, scavenger birds considered unclean by law, flew to Elijah. In their beaks they carried bread and meat. These dark-winged messengers, sent from the hand of God, sustained the prophet while the kingdom starved. Can you imagine the scene? A rugged man alone in a rocky canyon, being served his daily meals by birds. It was a surreal, intimate act of divine provision. Elijah would eat, thank God, and watch the slow, relentless passage of the sun across the empty sky, a constant reminder of the judgment he had pronounced. He was in hiding, yes, but he was not abandoned. He was being sustained, prepared for the next stage of a divine war he had just begun. He prayed, he waited, and he learned the profound lesson that God's care is found not just in the grand pronouncements in a king's palace, but in the quiet, impossible detail of a raven's beak. Time in the wilderness moves differently. For Elijah, hiding by the brook of Cherith, the days bled one into the next, marked only by the rising and setting of a merciless sun and the faithful arrival of his feathered providers. He was isolated from the world of men, but he was in deep communion with God. The solitude stripped away all pretense, leaving only the raw core of his faith. He felt the pain of his people, the suffering brought on by the drought he himself had announced. Was this God's only way? To break a nation, to bring it back to himself? The questions were heavy, but his trust, nourished by the daily miracle of bread and meat from a raven's beak, held firm. But then God introduced a new test, a new lesson in dependency. The drought was relentless, its grip tightening not just on the lands of Ahab, but on the entire region. The Brook of Cherith, which had been Elijah's source of life, began to fail. The cheerful gurgle of water over stones softened to a weak trickle, and then a series of stagnant pools. Finally, it was gone. The mud at the bottom of the ravine cracked into a mosaic of despair. The source of God's provision had dried up. Fear, cold and sharp, could have easily pierced Elijah's heart. It is one thing to trust God when the miracle is flowing. It is another entirely when the well runs dry. He could have despaired, thinking God had abandoned him, but his time in the wilderness had forged a different kind of faith, one that waited for the next instruction. He looked at the dry riverbed, his throat parched, and prayed, and God spoke. "Get up and go to a town called Zarephath in the region of Sidon. I have chosen a widow there to take care of you." The instruction was baffling. Zarephath, that was in Phoenicia, the homeland of Jezebel, the heartland of Baal worship. And a widow? In a time of famine, widows were the most destitute, the most vulnerable. How could a starving widow provide for him? It seemed like a command to walk from a dry riverbed into the jaws of death. Yet Elijah did not question. He did not complain. He simply got up, his body weak from the heat, but his spirit resolute, and began the long journey north. The walk to Zarephath was a pilgrimage through a dying world. The sun beat down, turning the air into a furnace. The ground was iron hard, the dust rising in choking clouds with every step. He saw no green, only the skeletal remains of trees and the brown, brittle stalks of what were once fields of grain. He saw the faces of the people he passed, gaunt, haunted, their eyes hollow with hunger and despair. This was the cost of idolatry, a physical manifestation of a spiritual famine. Tired, thirsty, and covered in dust, he finally reached the gate of Zarephath. He scanned the faces of the people, looking for a sign. And then he saw her. A woman, her clothes worn thin, her face etched with a quiet desperation, was gathering sticks. There was a finality in her movements, a sense of one performing a last, sorrowful task. Elijah felt a stirring in his spirit. This was her. He called out, his voice raspy from the journey, "Please bring me a little water in a jar so I can have a drink." The woman looked up, startled. She saw a stranger, clearly an Israelite, a man of God by his bearing. Though she had little to spare, compassion moved her. She nodded and turned to fetch the water. As she walked away, Elijah called out again, his next request feeling impossibly cruel. "And please bring me a piece of bread, too." The woman stopped dead. Her shoulders slumped and she turned back, the fragile dam of her composure breaking. Tears welled in her eyes, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of sorrow and bitter irony, "I don't have any bread. I have nothing. All that is left is a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I was just gathering these sticks to go home and make one last meal for my son and me. After we eat it, we will have nothing left. We will lie down and die." Her words were a portrait of utter hopelessness. Elijah listened, his heart aching for her pain, but his mind filled with the promise of God. He spoke to her, his voice gentle but firm with divine authority. "Don't be afraid." How could she not be afraid? Her world was ending. "Go home and do as you have planned, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The widow stared at him. It was a lunatic's promise, a cruel joke, to give away the very last of her food to a stranger based on a promise from a foreign god. Every rational instinct screamed at her to refuse, to clutch her meager resources to her chest. But as she looked into Elijah's eyes, she saw not cruelty or madness, but an unwavering, peaceful conviction. Perhaps it was the sheer desperation of her situation, the thought that she had nothing left to lose. Or perhaps, in that moment, a tiny seed of faith, alien to her Baal-worshipping culture, began to sprout in the barren soil of her heart. She made a choice. She chose to trust the impossible. She went home and did exactly as Elijah had said. With trembling hands, she took the last of her flour, the last of her oil, and baked a small loaf of bread. She walked back and gave it to the prophet. Then she returned to her empty jar and jug to prepare for death. But when she looked inside, she gasped. There was still a handful of flour. There was still a little oil. It was not full, but it was not empty. She made bread for herself and her son, and they ate. The next day she went back to the jar, expecting it to be empty. It was not. She went to the jug. It was not. And so it went day after day, a quiet, continuous miracle in a small, humble home. Every single day there was just enough. The jar of flour was never empty. The jug of oil never ran dry. Elijah, the widow, and her son lived on the bread of faith while the world outside starved. Through this simple, profound act, Elijah learned that God's power is not just in grand, sweeping judgments like a drought, but also in the quiet, sustaining miracle of a handful of flour and a little oil, provided in the heart of enemy territory through the faith of a desperate Gentile widow. Life in the small house in Zarephath settled into a strange, miraculous rhythm. The world beyond their door was in the throes of a famine, a slow, grinding apocalypse of hunger and thirst. But within their walls there was the daily, impossible reality of the flour that never ran out and the oil that never ceased. The widow's initial desperate act of faith had blossomed into a quiet, profound trust. She no longer looked at the jar and jug with surprise, but with a deep, settled gratitude. The God of this strange Israelite prophet was real. He was a provider, a protector. Elijah, in turn, was no longer just a guest, but a part of their small family. He shared their meals, prayed with them, and taught the boy about the God who could command the heavens and still care for a single jar of flour. But faith, even when nurtured by miracles, is often tested by the deepest fires of human suffering. One day, the widow's son, the sole focus of her love and the only reason for her existence, fell ill. It was a sudden, vicious sickness. His fever raged. His breathing grew shallow, and despite his mother's frantic efforts, he grew weaker and weaker. Then, the worst thing a mother can imagine happened. He stopped breathing. Life left his small body. A grief so immense and so raw that it bordered on madness consumed the widow. She held her son's limp body, her wails echoing in the small house that had so recently been a sanctuary of peace. In her agony, her nascent faith shattered, and she lashed out at the man who had brought this strange God into her life. She confronted Elijah, her eyes wild with pain and accusation. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come here to remind me of my sin and to kill my son?" Her question was a dagger to Elijah's heart. Had God saved them from starvation only to inflict this greater, more intimate cruelty? Elijah's own soul was plunged into turmoil. He had no answers for her, only a shared sense of horror. He gently took the boy from her arms, his own heart heavy as lead, and carried him upstairs to the small room where he slept. He laid the child on his own bed. This was a crisis not just for the woman, but for him. He was God's representative. Was this God's will? He fell to his knees and cried out to God, his prayer not a polite petition but a raw, desperate argument. "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" He stretched himself out over the boy's body, once, twice, 3 times, a strange, desperate act of identification with the child's death. He poured all of his spirit, all of his faith, into one final plea. Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. And in the silence of the upper room, the ultimate miracle unfolded. The boy's chest stuttered, then rose with a breath. Color returned to his cheeks. His eyes fluttered open. He was alive. Overwhelmed with a joy as profound as his earlier despair, Elijah picked up the boy and carried him back downstairs. He presented him to his mother, who was crumpled on the floor in a heap of sorrow. "Look," Elijah said softly, "your son is alive." The widow looked up, saw her living, breathing child, and the grief in her eyes was washed away by a flood of sheer, disbelieving joy. She hugged her son, her tears now tears of gratitude. She turned to Elijah, her faith forged anew in the fires of death and resurrection, now unbreakable. "Now I know," she said, her voice filled with awe, "that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." After this, Elijah knew his time in Zarephath was over. God had a larger stage for him. For 3 long years, the drought had held Israel in its grip. God spoke to him again, "Go and show yourself to King Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." The confrontation was set for Mount Carmel. When Ahab saw Elijah, his face contorted with years of pent-up rage. "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" he spat. Elijah's reply was like a thunderclap. "I have not made trouble for Israel. You and your family have by turning away from the Lord and worshiping Baal. Now summon the people of Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Ahab, perhaps out of desperation for rain or a morbid curiosity to see this final showdown, agreed. The stage was set for one of the greatest contests in history. On one side, 850 richly robed, state-sponsored prophets of the pagan gods. On the other, a single, solitary man in camel's hair. Elijah addressed the gathered, wavering crowd. "How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." The people remained silent, their spirits broken by famine, their loyalties confused. Elijah proposed the test: 2 bulls, 2 altars. Each side would prepare their sacrifice, but light no fire. The God who answers by fire, he is God. The people agreed. The prophets of Baal went first. From morning until noon, they performed their frantic, wild rites. They chanted, "Baal, answer us!" They leaped and danced around their altar. They worked themselves into a frenzy. There was no answer, only silence. At noon, Elijah began to mock them, his words dripping with sarcasm. "Shout louder. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Goaded by his taunts, they became even more desperate, shouting louder, slashing themselves with swords and spears until their blood flowed, a gruesome, pathetic display. But the sky remained silent and empty. As evening approached, it was Elijah's turn. He calmly called the people closer. He took 12 stones, 1 for each tribe of Israel, and repaired the Lord's broken altar. He dug a trench around it. He placed the wood and the bull on the altar. Then he did the unthinkable. He ordered the people to douse the entire sacrifice and the wood with water, 4 large jars 3 times over, until the water soaked everything and filled the trench. It was a public act of supreme, almost reckless confidence in his God. Then Elijah stepped forward and prayed. His prayer was not a frantic shout, but a clear, direct appeal. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Before he had even finished speaking, a terrifying, brilliant flash consumed the mountaintop. Fire from the Lord fell from the clear sky. It did not just burn the sacrifice. It consumed everything, the bull, the wood, the stones of the altar, the very soil, and it licked up every drop of water in the trench. The people, witnessing this raw, cosmic power, fell on their faces in terror and awe, crying out with one voice, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The contest was over. The victory was absolute. Elijah ordered the capture of Baal's prophets, and they were executed for leading the nation astray. Then he told Ahab to go eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain. While Ahab went, Elijah climbed to the top of Carmel, knelt down, and prayed for the rain he had promised. He sent his servant 7 times to look toward the sea. 6 times the servant returned with the same report, "There is nothing." But on the 7th time he returned, saying, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." That was all Elijah needed to hear. Soon the sky grew black, the wind howled, and a torrential downpour drenched the thirsty land. The drought was broken. But the victory on Mount Carmel was followed by a profound and humanizing crash. When Jezebel heard what Elijah had done, she was not converted. She was enraged. She sent a messenger to Elijah with a chilling oath. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them." The threat pierced through Elijah's victory-fueled adrenaline. The man who had faced down 850 prophets, called fire from heaven, and ended a drought was suddenly terrified by the threat of one woman. He ran for his life, his mind consumed by fear and exhaustion. This is the paradox of the human spirit, capable of monumental faith one moment and crippling fear the next. He fled deep into the wilderness, finally collapsing under a broom tree, utterly spent. He prayed for death. "I have had enough, Lord," he whispered. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." But God did not answer with a rebuke. He answered with grace. An angel touched the sleeping prophet, providing bread and water. "Get up and eat," the angel said, "for the journey is too much for you." Strengthened by this divine meal, Elijah traveled for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, the very place where Moses had received the law. He took refuge in a cave, still nursing his despair. God's voice came to him there, not in a shout, but in a question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah poured out his heart, his feelings of failure and loneliness. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." God instructed him to stand on the mountain. A mighty wind tore through the peaks, shattering rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. An earthquake shook the very foundations of the mountain, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. A raging fire swept past, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a sound, a gentle whisper, a still, small voice. When Elijah heard it, he knew. He covered his face and stood at the entrance of the cave. God was not in the spectacle, the noise, the raw power of Carmel. He was in the intimacy of the whisper. God gently corrected Elijah's despair, informing him that there were still 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed to Baal. He was not alone, and God gave him a new mission, to anoint new kings, and most importantly, to anoint his successor, a man named Elisha. Recommissioned and restored, Elijah found Elisha plowing a field. He walked up and simply placed his cloak over Elisha's shoulders, a symbolic transfer of his prophetic office. Elisha understood immediately. In a radical act of commitment, he slaughtered his oxen, used the plowing equipment for firewood, and held a farewell feast, leaving his old life behind forever to follow the prophet. Years passed. The time came for Elijah's departure from the earth. He knew God was going to take him. As he traveled with Elisha, he repeatedly tried to leave his student behind. But Elisha's loyalty was absolute. As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." At the Jordan River, Elijah took his cloak, struck the water, and it parted, and they crossed on dry ground. "What can I do for you before I am taken?" Elijah asked. Elisha's request was profound. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Not a request for more power, but the inheritance of a firstborn son, the right to carry on the legacy. As they walked and talked, a sudden blinding vision appeared. A chariot of fire, pulled by horses of fire, descended from the sky, separating the two men. A whirlwind engulfed Elijah, and he was lifted up into the heavens. He never experienced death. Elisha watched, crying out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." He had witnessed his master's glorious ascent. He picked up the fallen cloak, the symbol of his new authority, and walked back to the Jordan. He struck the water, crying, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The waters parted again. The spirit of Elijah now rested on Elisha. The work would continue. The life of Elijah is a story of dramatic contrasts, of staggering public power and private crushing despair, of divine fire and a gentle whisper, of national confrontation and intimate provision. So what is the core lesson we can draw from this epic life? The central lesson is that true faith is not the absence of fear or doubt, but rather the choice to obey God in the midst of it. Elijah was undeniably a man of immense courage, yet the narrative makes a point of showing us his profound humanity. The same prophet who could boldly stand before a hostile king and call down fire from heaven was also the man who ran for his life from a single woman's threat and prayed for death under a broom tree. Why is this detail so crucial? Because it makes Elijah relatable. His moments of weakness do not invalidate his moments of strength. They contextualize them. They teach us that God does not exclusively use superheroes who are immune to fear. He uses broken, frightened, and exhausted people who, despite their feelings, make the choice to trust and take the next step he commands. His recovery at Mount Horeb is perhaps the most personal and profound part of his journey. When Elijah was at his lowest, God didn't meet him with more fire and spectacle, the very things that had defined his public ministry. Instead, God met him in a gentle whisper. This teaches us that while God's power can be awesome and public, his restoration is often quiet, personal, and intimate. He wasn't disappointed in Elijah's burnout. He understood it. He provided for his physical needs, food, and rest, before addressing his spiritual crisis. Therefore, Elijah's story challenges us to reevaluate our own faith. Do we believe we must be fearless to be faithful? Do we think our moments of doubt disqualify us from being used by God? Elijah proves otherwise. His legacy is a testament to a God who sustains his servants in desolate ravines, provides for them through foreign widows, vindicates them on fiery mountaintops, and most importantly, restores them with a quiet whisper when they feel utterly alone and defeated. The ultimate call is not to be a perfect hero, but to be an obedient servant, trusting that